We are in Psalm 119, and we are moving to a new section. It's a section, the Hebrew letter of Zayin. So we'll be looking at this, starting this tonight, and probably finishing it next week, right before we run into our week of meetings. If you want to look in your Bibles there, I'll put the text up there as well. But as we look at this section, one of the things I've been enjoying doing, and just one of those hermeneutical principles, is you always look for things that are repeated as a part of things that are emphasized. And so while we've been going through the Psalms, I've been in each section trying to pick up just some of the repeated themes and then expanding that into the book of Psalms itself, and just trying to highlight some of that. And so obviously two ways. Remember your word, and so and this is in our section, so verse 49. So here's the psalmist making a request, really saying of God, God, remember your word to your servant, and then later saying, I will remember your name. You can search both directions, and you can see some interesting parallels. But I just really went at the request of the psalmist, because it's an interesting one to me, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. When you're asking God to remember something, are you suggesting God might forget? Well, I think we know better than that. So that's not the point. So the point we'll talk about in just a moment. But here's some other text that the psalmist is doing the same thing. God, remember. So Psalm 25:6. Remember your mercy, O Lord. Remember your steadfast love. As the psalmist plea. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me. For the sake of your goodness, O Lord. Psalm 74 and verse 2. Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, which you have redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you have dwelt. Again, Zion, Jerusalem. Okay. 74 and verse 18, remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs and a foolish people reviles you. Remember how short my time is, for what vanity you've created all the children of men. Remember, O Lord, how your servants are mocked, and how I bear in my heart the insults of many nations. Remember me, O Lord, when you show favor to your people. Help me when you save them. So these calls for remembrance, both remembering him, remembering God's nature, his promises, remembering his goodness, all of these petitions, and then also remember your enemies, remember how they mocked you, remember the insults to your people, remember the suffering of your people. So the question behooves us to ask a couple questions. First, why do we ask people to remember their promises to us? Or why do we ask them to remember things? Come on, this is not a hard question. It's not a trick question. Come on. Huh? Okay, well, maybe for our benefit. What? People forget, right? Simple, right? Sometimes they forget. Now, they forget sometimes not necessarily, sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it's not so innocent, right? People fail to keep their promises. I think if anybody has said, I've never failed to keep their promise, they're probably lying. Right? Because we've all made promises, sometimes very sincere promises, but then we run front into this reality. We're not God. And we don't control everything. And sometimes the promise we make, we simply have no ability to keep. Sometimes we make promises to people that we know we can't keep. All right? We shouldn't do that. Right? Should never make promises that we don't either intend to keep or have the ability to keep. But sometimes things just change, and we have no capacity to follow through. So in all of that, obviously, God does not share that with us. God never lacks the capacity to fulfill his promises. He's never surprised by changing circumstances, right? It's not possible for that to happen with God. So the psalmist is certainly not asking, so that's the second side, the point of asking God. He's not asking God to remember, as in suggesting God could be a man. He's not afraid that God would change his mind or ever lack his ability to keep his promises. So by asking God to remember his promise, the psalmist is, in effect, causing who to remember his promises? Himself. And then not only to remember God's promises, but remember what about God? Is he saying, God, remember your promise or your word to your servant? He's not concerned God's going to forget or God's not going to come through. He shouldn't be, right? If he is, he's got other problems. Okay? All right, since that text doesn't follow with, now I'm repenting of those of my bad theology, God, thinking wrong thoughts about you, since it doesn't follow with that, he's obviously not suggesting something about God here that he shouldn't be. So he is now reminding himself not only of God's promises, but of God's what? Okay, of God's faithfulness, or if we just put it in a generic sense, God's character, right? Who this God is. The one to whom I'm praying, who is he? Well, he's a faithful God. He keeps his promises. He's the Almighty. He has all the power. He's the all-wise God. He's not made of one, I've made promises that weren't wise. Later figured out that wasn't a very smart promise. I shouldn't keep that one. And I have to go back to somebody and say, look, I hate to break my word, but I can't keep that. It would not be right for me to do. Why? Because I lack the wisdom, and I made a promise, a foolish promise. And then I have to back out because to keep it would be sin. So, God doesn't have those issues, right? So here he's reminding himself, and so as he recounts, and really as he prays, God, remember your promises, he is really causing, in this sense now, for himself to begin to reflect on God's promises and on God's goodness and the very character of God. So knowing that who God is then brings an anticipation also, because as I think about God's promises and I remember who he is, then I should be anticipating God delivering on his promises. Because God's going to deliver all that he has promised. And so that cultivates an anticipation of those promises being fulfilled, which then generates then a living in anticipation of those things, of the good that God has declared himself that he's going to do, and then connected that, a desire in the psalmist's heart to see it happen. Because he even goes on to say that his hope is fixed in that reality. God, you're going to fulfill your promises, and therein my hope lies. It doesn't lie in other things. It lies in the faithful God who has all the power, the ability to fulfill his word. And I'd suggest to you that it really, but we'll get to here, but in this same way, think about the Lord when he taught the disciples to pray. Okay, simple text. We've recited the Lord's Prayer, which we typically call it, right? So our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. All right, so there you and I are being taught part of a model prayer, that part of our prayer is to be praying, and the hallowing is really praying that God would so work in his world to cause his name to be honored. It's not praise. Hallowed doesn't mean I'm praising God. What it means when I pray, hallowed be thy name, is I'm praying for God to so work in his world to cause his name to receive the honor that is due. Okay? That's the first part. But then the second part is praying for God's kingdom to come, right? And we are to, now let me ask you a question. Is God's kingdom coming? Next question. Do you live like you really believe it? Because that's where the gap happens, right? So God's kingdom's coming. Is there anything anyone can do can stop the kingdom from coming? So all the little shakeups in the world, and when something happens over here, and that may mean, and Israel's going to do this, and they're going to do that, and then there's going to be a nuclear thing over here, and this over here, and then there's a one world system, and it's just everybody's got to follow that, and I got to get so caught up in what's going to happen next. Why? Is anything going to happen around the world that is going to stop Jesus Christ from returning exactly when he plans to return and accomplish and establish the kingdom God has promised to establish? Is anyone anywhere going to stop that from happening? No. And will that be a good news day for the people of God? It will be a great day for the people of God. Fact of it is, you and I haven't even begun to fathom how great that day will be when we see our Savior face to face. We've only tasted and seen that the Lord is good. The experience of the Lord's presence is in front of me in the fullness and the totality of joy that will be ours in the Savior's presence. And we don't know life without sin, and we don't know life without suffering, and we don't know life in the presence of God, but I will. That day is absolutely rock solid certain. It is coming. And the psalmist prays, Lord, remember your word to your servant. Jesus teaches us to pray, Father, your kingdom come. And he's not teaching us to pray, Father, your kingdom come. I really hope it will, and I'm hoping you're strong enough to deliver. No, he's teaching us to pray so that we might begin to live with anticipation of that day. that this day is certain for the children of God. Now, if you don't know if you're a child of God, praying that way means nothing to you. But if you know you belong to God, he's bought you with precious blood, and you're his child, that day ought to mean everything to you. That's what it really means, seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added to you. I'm not seeking to make it into the kingdom. If I'm God's child, I'm a member of that kingdom. I'm not trying to accomplish something so I'll be there, because I'm never going to be there based on my accomplishment. I'm going to be there because of what Christ has already done and clothed me in that righteousness. So I'm not there on my own merits, never a chance. When I seek first the kingdom, what it is a part of setting my affections on what God has promised so that I don't get caught up in all of this and live for the wrong things. These things are not my priorities. Now, I've got to have a lot of them. There's certain things I got to have to live and survive and do this and that, but they're not what I live for. They're not what I make my life about. Because if I make my life about them, then I'm not seeking first the kingdom, nor am I living in anticipation of that. And so it brings that principle to bear that I think we're taught, which then comes in, I know we're taught, and is to then be pressed into our own lives that would impact our own affections. Because our affections should be set on what is certain, not on what is happen chance. All the things of the world that we take pleasure in a lot of things, and God's given us a lot of good gifts that can rightly be enjoyed. But at any point in time, I enjoy the gift more than I enjoy the giver, I'm out of order. I'm actually an idolater. Reality is that's just idolatry. To love the gifts that God gives more than I love the giver who gave them is just idolatry. And we all struggle with it. You didn't know this yet. Maybe you haven't figured this out, but you have an idolatrous heart by nature. Okay? Because we're lovers of self. And guess what? The fact that you're a self is a good gift from God. And we tend to worship the self rather than the one who created it. Okay? So we get it backwards all the time. And so we're going to fight that issue. But that's why we're to cultivate our affections forward. And it's not just one of those, every now and then, Pastor, I throw out that is the kingdom coming? Yes, all right. We can all kind of rah-rah cheer it. But the reality is you're supposed to live with that reality ever in front of you. And you're supposed to meditate on that reality and spend time studying that reality so that you build and set your affections. I told our kids in chapel this morning, I said, I don't have anybody quite 16 yet, but I said, let's just say you were going to have your 16th birthday. Ask one of them what their favorite car was. And they told me. I said, so let's just suppose now your parents said, you know what? We bought that car. It's in a garage, set aside, and the day you hit your 16th birthday or the Christmas of your 16th birthday, the keys are yours. Do you think you'd be in anticipation of that? I said, well, God has promised me something so much far greater than any earthly treasure anybody has ever dangled in front of me. I know what it is to live in anticipation. There's a lot of things that I bought, purchased, were going to purchase, was promised, and you can anticipate, and they motivate you. They motivate you, they encourage you, you live for them, you're eager about it. You tear into the paper or whatever, you look forward to the day or the time, maybe it's a trip you're going to take, you've anticipated for a long time, and you just can't wait to go. We know what it is to live in anticipation. The question is, do we really know what it is to live in anticipation of the presence of God? And if we don't, it's because we really haven't spent enough time with God in his word and asked him to cultivate that in our hearts. And the reason why we don't do that is because, well, it's a number of things. One, we live in a busy world filled with noise, and we get busy, and we're just busy living life. In the midst of living life, we get distracted. And we forget what life's really about. That's one cause. Another cause is the other treasures become too important for us. They blind us to a greater glory. And we get blinded to the greater glory and we live for lesser glories, which is a foolish way to live. Because then we're emotionally up and down, all connected to when those glories come and when they don't. And this is really, how do we get around that? How do we not live that way? Well, the psalmist has given us a window into that. Remember your word to your servant. Has God promised to bring you into a kingdom? Okay. All right. So if you're God's servant, then you have a promise, a word from God to you as his child that is absolutely certain. And in that, you're to make your hope. In fact, he says, you have made me, which you have made me hope, which is an interesting phrase we'll talk about in a minute. So, remember your word to your servant, which you made me hope. So how does the psalmist identify himself, and why is that important? Okay, he says, your servant. So why is that? That's the identification. Everybody agree? Okay, he identifies himself as God's servant. Literally, the Hebrew word is ebed, which is parallel to the New Testament term doulos, which means slave. Honestly, our New Testament, I've said this before, and I'll just throw it out there again, our English translations have not done us a great favor by avoiding the slave term and giving us the servant term. They haven't done us a real favor. I know why they've done it. You can study it in history, and I know why they've done it. They've done it to avoid some of the ugliness of the slave trade. So they don't want association with that, so they've avoided the word slave because they didn't like some of the nuances that would be brought over with that idea. But there is a difference in our mindset between a servant and a slave. Big difference, okay? And because of that, we sometimes miss the freight of what's being said. So 90% of the time, probably 99, I haven't studied it that far, but at least 90% of the time you run in the word servant in your Bible, it really means slave. Especially when it says like servant of Christ, servant of God, all of those mean slave. There are a few places the word for deacon or a deacon means to serve. There's a few places where it'll be used as a servant. That will be translated that way in a few places. But 90% of everywhere you run the word servant, it's either the Hebrew word for slave or the Greek word for slave. So why is it important to identify yourself as a slave of God? Okay. All right. So, I mean, along the lines of terms of endearment. Okay. Go ahead. Right. Right. Okay. So he's reflecting on the tax collector it's the Pharisee, isn't it? It's the Pharisee, and then the tax collector, Pharisee tax collector in the temple. Tax collector, he wouldn't raise his head. And we're getting into the issue, which is to self-identify as a slave is to acknowledge that I belong to another, right? Jerry, another thought? Okay. All right. Bob? Sure. Sure. I mean, it's a purchase issue. It's who I belong to. It's who I'm responsible to. Go ahead. Okay. A slave I mean, the slave doesn't get up in the morning and say, you know what, today I think I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E. I've got my plans, my agenda, and they would rule and dominate my affections. That's not how a slave lives. A slave lives for the pleasure of its master. And his life is completely ruled by the nature of the master who owns him. Good master could be a good life. Bad master, cruel master, could be a horrible life. Because he doesn't control that, right? Now, the good news is by being a slave, and part of what the nuance why it was avoided is to avoid some of the negatives. But the other reality is when wealthy people, the more wealthy the person and the more benevolent the person was who owned you, the more status you even had in society. Okay, that's the way it worked in New Testament, even Old Testament slavery. Here's the reality. My father or my master, my owner, is as gracious, as loving, as kind as anybody could ever imagine. But that doesn't change the fact that he's still a master. And it doesn't change the fact that I come as a dependent slave to a master, and I have hope because that master has promised good to me. Because if he hadn't promised good to me, I have no hope. Because only if the master promises good do I have hope of good. Because nobody else can provide it for me. I belong to him. It doesn't exist. My good does not exist outside my relationship with him. A slave knows that reality. Now that is an important self-identification, because if you don't have that, you will look for good outside of your relationship with God, and it does not exist. It's all a fantasy. It's smoke and mirrors that will draw you away from your master and cause you to serve other masters. You belong to the Lord. If you keep that straight, then you also know your good is always connected to him, and he can be the only provision of it. And if you look for others, no other master it owns you. He's not going to provide for you. They may try to lure you away, so to speak, but they're doing it to your destruction, never to your good. So it is a very important self-identification. It's a very important mindset to keep, because elsewise, and part of that too comes back to the nature of our culture. Okay? Let me ask you, how many of you went out to eat sometime this week? I mean, since Sunday, you've gone out somewhere to eat. All right. Did you wash any of the dishes? Did you serve any of the other customers? So you went and you were served. All right. Anybody go shopping? You go to the store this week? Did you stock any of the shelves? Did you clean any of the floors? Did you take anybody else's groceries out? So you went and you were served. We live in a culture that 90% of the time we're being served. Everywhere we go, we act like we're masters and other people are there to serve us. We have a really hard time living like slaves. And when people treat you like a slave, whoo, it's not usually pretty. It's not usually pretty. The volitional response that comes from you is, you can't treat me like that. Who do you think you are? Don't you know who I am? I mean, these are the things that just flow out of us. If our service, when we go to the store, or we go, and if we go to the store and the shelf wasn't stocked with what we want, we are not happy. And we're going to tell somebody that. We go to the restaurant, we don't get seated right away, and somebody else's order comes to their table before yours. Oh no. Steak wasn't cooked right, it's going back, and you want a free meal. I mean, we know what it is to be served. We like to be in the position of master. The problem with all of that is it directly affects the way you pray and relate to God. Because we come to God more times treating him like a butler than we come to God treating him like he's a master. And that radically destroys our fellowship with God. God will not be treated by you like he's a butler. He will not. Remember, if I regard iniquity in my heart, he will not hear me. You treat God like he exists to serve you, you know why your prayers go no higher in the ceiling. He does not exist to serve you. You exist for his glory. And there's nothing better you could exist for, nor there's nothing better you could experience. All of his good is connected to you understanding that and living that reality. All your good is connected to that. And if you look for good outside of that, you pervert your relationship with God and you pervert your prayer life. So it's a very important identity. It's a very important approach in our worship to God. So let me come back. Sorry, back up to that. As he said, you made me hope. Okay, so remember your word to your servant, which I would take. I mean, you could take it both commands and promises, but in light of the fact that it's his hope, we're talking about promises. Okay, my hope is rooted in what you've promised to do, God. So what is the essence then of biblical hope? When the psalmist says, this is my hope, what is that essence? What is he, I mean, is this, do you understand the question? Maybe I could rephrase it, but the essence, no, the source of my hope is God's promises. What is the essence of biblical hope? What does it really mean to hope? Comfort, right. Right, but we use that phrase, and I'm just picking on, all right, I hope in the Lord. Okay, my hope is in the Lord. What does it mean to say my hope is in the Lord? My hope. My what? My trust, okay, that would be an aspect. What's that? Faith. Expectation. Okay, confidence, expectation. Okay, as far as where I'm going is right here, okay? When the psalmist said, God, you've made promises, and I know who you are, therefore my hope is in those promises, it is not, man, I just kind of hope this happens. This is my confident expectation is that, God, you're going to do exactly what you said you're going to do. So my hope is in the Lord is not, I mean, we throw that phrase out there a lot. At times people are in the middle of trouble and we say, oh, hope in the Lord. What do you mean by that? What promise did you bring to somebody? Just hope in the Lord. Well, hope what? It's kind of like sometimes people tell people, well, just have faith. You know, almost a blind leap in the dark. If you think faith is a blind leap off a bridge, you don't know what faith is. Okay? If you think hope is, well, just generically hope in God, you don't know what hope is. Hope is linked to the promises of God that he's going to fulfill. My hope is in exactly what God has promised to do. That's where my hope is. And go ahead. A dependent, yes. Well, yeah, absolutely. That's part of being a servant or a slave. I'm absolutely dependent. God, I have no right to make, I mean, that's part of his, also when he's saying, Lord, remember your word to your servant, and I am your slave. As a slave, I have no right to ask you for anything. The fact you've promised to provide me anything is overwhelmingly good news. It's all grace. I'm a slave, you're a master. Not only are you a master, you're the God of the universe who've made me your slave, and there's no more incredible relationship than that because I did nothing to deserve it, and you've promised me good, which I don't deserve, but Lord, I'm anticipating it because I know who you are. And thus he says, you've made me hope. Literally, the Hebrew verb there is a causative verb to say that you've been brought into this state, the state of hope or anticipation, expectation, because of what God has done. Because of who you know God to be and what God has promised to do, it has had the effect of bringing you to this place where you are filled with anticipation and expectation of God fulfilling his promises. Oh, yeah. Yes, yes. Yeah, I would say hope really gets refined biblically and connected to exactly to God's promises, and thus it should produce in us the confident expectation. So, another for instance, I mean, we know, and this can be abused, and it has been, and you've got, but God has promised all things work together for good for them that love God and are called according to his purposes, right? Is that a promise? So, in the midst of life's adversity, when you're beginning to say, why, bad, have no idea why this happened, you begin to feel hopeless or run over, here's a promise from God that you're not believing, right? It's just unbelief in my heart when I respond that way because I have a promise from God that I am to link my hope in. And my hope is, Lord, this is a difficult thing, and I'm going through the midst of what may be a heartache or whatever that may be. It's very difficult to go through. But my absolute confidence, God, is you're working in this situation and you're going to accomplish good because I love you. Because I am one who loves you because you first loved me. I'm your child. I have rock solid, unquestionable confidence that, God, you're going to do good through this. Therefore, I won't be shaken. Therefore, I can rest in the Lord. and I can wait. I don't know when God's going to fulfill his promise. He gave me the promise. He didn't tell me the date when. He did tell me how it's going to happen. Now, maybe not in some specific details. In the end detail, in terms of the great promise that I'm anticipating, he's told me exactly how that's happening. His son's coming back. Kingdom's going to be established. I got tons of detail, what that kingdom is going to look like, how it's going to function, and the joy that's going to be there. I've got lots that God's told me about the how. He just hasn't told me the when, right? But he has said, Billy, it's certain, live in anticipation of it, which is what helps put everything else in perspective. I did it again. Oh, me and this thing are going to have... All right, sorry. But I talk with my hands, so if you hadn't figured that out, you all have, though. So, which also means I throw my clicker around. So, all right. But this hope is really has to go beyond I hope I see this work out. That's not what God, in the midst of trials, God has not given you a promise. You can say, well, I hope I see the good. You may or may not see the good. You know it? Because our eyes are so finite, we tend to get focused on ourselves, and we don't know all the ways God has used that circumstance to accomplish his will in so many other lives than you. And so at times, our myopic focus is right here, so I may go through a trial, come to the end of it, and I'm still going, I don't see the good. I don't see the good because the way I want to see good is it's just got to be really something I perceive as good, and it's got to be good for me, and I really want it soon, kind of like go through window A, order, pay at window, and pick up in window B. That's my idea of good, you know. A to B, I'm done, good. All right, Jim, you had a comment? Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's even how he picked up the knife to slay his own son. Right, good. Right. Okay. You're talking 11? Yeah, all right. Right. Sure. But, faith, hope, love, the greatest of these is love, right? Because, right, right. But I wouldn't merge it necessarily. Faith and hope are still a little bit different. They have a lot of right. Yeah, well, faith is part of what connects to what gives us the confidence in God's promises, thus we have hope. Okay. Right. Not seen, right. Absolutely. But faith is what gives us the confidence in God's promises, right? Biblical faith, remember, faith is a gift from God. Well, actually, I don't want to trump all that. Anyway, I could get in the whole conversation, but faith is a gift from God. Therefore, I know this. If you and I have faith, we trust God's promises. If you don't trust God's promises, you don't have faith, or at least you're not exercising it in that moment, right? Because faith will trust God. It can't do otherwise. It's a gift from God. Faith can never distrust God. Can't happen. Faith trusts God. Therefore, the promises of God are trust. We trust them. We believe them with absolute confidence. Thus, we have hope. And that hope is not a wavering thing. And that's how we avoid being double-minded. That's how we avoid being two-souled, unstable in all we do. That really does connect back to the prayer of faith, okay? How do we ask in faith? Well, it all does interconnect. All right, we spent all our time on that one thing, but let me just jump right here for a moment because the connection that Art made with comfort. And I want to make one basic connection here. This is my comfort, my affliction, that your promises give me life. And we'll come back and talk about these false sorts of comforts, things we look for, and things and what they ultimately reveal. And you can stir on that one, all right? Next week we'll come back and talk about it.
But one of the things the psalmist is saying, and this is what I want to leave with, because our confidence is our anticipation, our hope, I should say, is that confident anticipation that God's going to fulfill his promises. And we have confidence, which is connected to faith, is where that confidence ultimately comes from. And that confidence then in the promises produces a hope that is an anticipation of the promise being fulfilled, which then creates and cultivates in me a desire for that to be fulfilled. So Father, your will be done. Not mine, your will be done, because there's nothing better. And when your will is done, I'll rejoice because I'm your slave. And there's nothing that makes me happier than seeing my master, my owner, honored. And he's not honored by a disobedient and rebellious slave. He's honored by one who rejoices and follows and rejoices in his good being accomplished, because it is my good too. Why? Because I belong to him. And he's determined to share that good with me, which is incredible. And here comes this other issue. We look oftentimes to all kinds of things to provide us comfort. Everyone in this room has faced some level of affliction in this last year. You're facing it maybe now. You will face it. I know that's not the good news. You will face affliction in this year. Things are going to happen, and you're going to look somewhere for comfort. And if you look outside of the God of all comfort, you will look in vain and you won't find it. And if we even look to the people around us and say, you should provide me comfort, they're not capable. They can provide maybe a temporary comfort. It's nice not to be suffering alone. We all like to share our suffering, don't we? So it's like nice not to be suffering alone. But you know what? It's all temporary, and no matter if you link and think your mate or somebody else or anybody else is going to be the one that's going to comfort your heart and they're going to do it for you, you will be disappointed because they are not capable. Because if God is the God of all comfort, comfort belongs to him and only he can give it. And then we'll see how it joins with the first verse we talked about, how hope is linked to promises, God's promises, so is comfort. And it's directly linked back to exactly what God has said about himself, and there's where we'll find the source, the genuine source of comfort, because we are commanded to comfort others with the same comfort we ourselves have been comforted by God. And what is that comfort? It's not some mystical feeling of somehow in the midst of my trial, I just feel better. In the midst of my trial, I now have hope. And why do I have hope? Because of the God who's promised. And now in the midst of comforting somebody else, what am I taking to them? The promises of God, because I can't help you. But God can. And his promises can bring comfort no matter the trial. No matter the depth, no matter the length, the severity of the trial, God's promises bring hope to the people of God. And that's where your comfort is found. Don't look for it otherwise. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your love, your goodness to us. Thank you for the privilege it is to serve you, the one true